Timofei Vladimirovich Sapronov was born on September 8, 1887, in Matushka. He was one of 7 children in a poor peasant family, living in a rundown house. In his own words, it was a brick hovel with broken window panes, with nothing around it except for a flimsy lean-to for an old nag who survived by eating all the straw off the roof of the house. Except for this miserable horse, we did not have a single animal, not even a chicken. At night, I would suddenly hear rolls of thunder, and a downpour would begin. My mother and father hid under the doorway of the hut, the 7 kids under the window frames. There was the babble of water coming down from the ceiling in big splashes, a real waterfall. When he was 7, Sapronov entered into his local village school, where he was teased by his peers for being poor. The next year, like so many young Russians during this time, he left school to become a worker. When he turned 12, Sapronov became the unpaid servant of a noble family in St. Petersburg. It was while working in St. Petersburg that the course of his life changed. The young Sapronov was introduced to revolutionary literature by another employee of the family, and while living in the capital, he witnessed a workers' demonstration for the first time, and he also witnessed it getting violently suppressed by the police. It was these experiences and new ideas that would determine the trajectory of his life. In 1900, Sapronov would leave St. Petersburg and return to his village again, where he worked as a shepherd. And then once he turned 15, he would become a subcontractor in a construction business. He also worked as a house painter, a teamster, and a yard keeper in order to make ends meet. In 1905, when he was 18, Sapronov moved to Moscow while the revolution was ongoing, and during which he was present at several demonstrations in the city. In the next couple of years, Sapronov would make contact with Social Democrat operatives, and he joined a short-lived union of construction workers in 1907. That same year, he would catch police attention. His place of residence would be searched, where the police would uncover illegal literature, and as a result, he would be exiled from the city. But he would return in 1910 and join a workers' artel. Around this time, many workers' artels would fold due to mismanagement, such as both of the ones which Sapronov would join between 1910 and 1911. The collapse of these artels prompted many workers, including Sapronov, to attempt once again to establish a trade union, a process which proved difficult in Russia, especially in Sapronov's trade of construction. As Victoria Benel writes, unionization proved exceptionally difficult due to the character of workers in the construction industry and the general political climate in the country. Construction workers ranked amongst the least urbanized and proletarianized segments of the Moscow labor force. Employment in the industry was seasonal and attracted men of peasant origin like Sapronov himself. Moscow construction workers retained their ties to the countryside and migrated annually to Moscow for the construction season. The pattern of migration, persistent links to the countryside, and widespread illiteracy among these semi-peasant workers presented serious obstacles to the formation of a trade union. The dangers associated with trade unionism created still another barrier to worker participation. Early efforts to establish a union in 1912 proved difficult for Sapronov. He spoke with workers in taverns, but found that although they desired a union, they doubted their ability to create one. And Sapronov too had doubts, for in 1912, he had little experience. He and the group of workers he had assembled that year were quite unsure on where to begin in the formation of their construction workers' union. For help, like many other workers, they decided to look towards the intelligentsia. Sapronov made contact with the Bolsheviks for the first time near the end of 1912. He would meet one A.E. Nikolaev of the Moscow Union of Printers, where he received advice and links to the broader workers' movement. That same year, Sapronov formally became a member of the RSDLP. After 2 years of work, Sapronov and his group would finally manage to form their own union in 1914, just before the First World War would begin. Sapronov's union was initially a success, but it faced several setbacks. Many of the union's leaders were mobilized by the war. Layoffs and the drafting of workers reduced the union's membership, and in 1915, Sapronov himself was drafted, which dealt ever greater damage to the union's leadership. But instead of allowing himself to get drafted, Sapronov went underground instead. While underground, he maintained various lines of communication with party members and the now illegal union, and he also distributed and maintained large amounts of illegal Bolshevik literature. In April 1915, he got arrested, but was released in September, and by December, he re-entered the Moscow underground and continued the work he was doing prior to his arrest. Sapronov, however, would be arrested in April again next year, based on information supplied to the police by informants. Following his arrest, Sapronov was forcibly drafted into the army, but after 3 months, he was allowed to leave due to poor health. In November 1916, because of heavy police surveillance, he moved to the Tushino suburb, where he managed to find employment at a factory and established contact with a local group of Social Democrats. As the story goes, the February Revolution caught everyone, including Sapronov, off guard. When it arrived, Sapronov did not sit on his hands. In March, he returned to Moscow, and back in the city, he reorganized the Moscow Central Bureau of Trade Unions, and he became its first chairman for about 5 days until he left for Tushino again. During his time in Moscow, Victoria Benel writes, As late as March 5th, worker Bolsheviks in the Union of Unions had little contact with representatives of the Central Committee in Moscow, and they lacked information concerning the party's position of events in progress. The Union of Unions supported the strike then underway in the city, whereas the Central Committee had called for a cessation. Even after learning of the Central Committee's position, the predominantly Bolshevik Union of Unions continued to advocate for a prolongation of the strike. Thus, in the very first days of the revolution, Moscow Bolsheviks demonstrated the spirit of non-compliance with the party center, which had long roots in the past and would in the future lead to acute intra-party struggles. For pretty much all of Sapronov's pre-February career, he was on his own. The help that the intelligentsia gave to the workers' movement essentially evaporated when the war started, and the top leadership was either abroad or in exile in Siberia. Thus, he grew to appreciate the potentials of the rank-and-file worker. All on his own, he managed to form a large cell in the factory in which he worked in the aftermath of the February Revolution, building it up into an organization of over 1,000 members before the October Revolt. Until the October Revolution occurred, Sapronov was active in the Moscow Soviets. He would become the chairman of the Moscow Province Soviet, chairman of the Concession Committee, the chairman of the Small Sovnarkom, and the secretary of the VTSIK. He was a member of the city's Revolutionary Military Committee, and following the October Revolution, he was one of the 175 Bolshevik delegates elected to the Constituent Assembly in November. When the Brest-Litovsk crisis arose, he sided with the left communists led by Bukharin, Osensky, and Vladimir Smirnov, the latter of whom we shall briefly pivot to. Vladimir Mikhailovich Smirnov was born on May 7, 1887, and unlike Sapronov, he came from a middle-class background and received a good education. He joined the Bolsheviks much sooner than Sapronov, 5 years to be exact, in 1907, a couple of years after the 1905 revolution. In 1909, he befriended Bukharin and Osensky at Moscow University and collaborated with them on party matters and student affairs. When Bukharin and Osensky were both arrested in 1910, it was Smirnov who took leadership of and rebuilt the decimated Moscow organization. When the war broke out, Smirnov was drafted and he was forced to serve as an officer in the Tsar's army up until the February Revolution, when he deserted and returned to Moscow. From there, he rejoined Bukharin and Osensky, and the trio were then thrust into leadership positions by Lenin. Before the October Revolution, he edited 2 important newspapers, and during the uprising, he was the organizer of an artillery detachment and a member of the Revolutionary Military Committee in Moscow. In its aftermath, he, along with his fellow economists, Bukharin and Osensky, joined the Supreme Economic Council in Petrograd, but he later returned to Moscow in 1918 after the Brest controversy was resolved. According to their comrade who survived them, and as I have already shown, the two were on opposite ends in life. But as Edward Duden puts it, Vladimir Smirnov was a direct contrast of Sapronov, a man wielding the pen, an economist by education, having a large vocabulary and a narrow circle, which he lost in front of a large, unknown audience. If Sapronov was a mass organizer, then V.M. Smirnov was an armchair scientist. He was in both public and private life painfully modest, a large amount of reading, irritation, and personal sensitivity. Modesty in relations with others attracted people to him, managing to know him closely. In him, there is much of an idealist and a neurotic. Despite this, they were of like mind when it came to the nature of the communist dictatorship, the rule of the Soviets, and what the revolution should represent. Because of their ideas, they were unceasing critics of the party, albeit respected ones, especially Sapronov, whose integrity no one could doubt. Smirnov, for one, was certainly doctrinaire, always wishing to stay true to Marx. And this can certainly be seen in his decision to name his child REM, which is an acronym for Revolution, Engels, Marx. Yes, that was his child's name. Revolution, Engels, Marx, Smirnov. After the first left communist opposition folded, these two formed the new phase of the opposition once the Civil War erupts. That is, they create the military opposition, which albeit was a left communist opposition trend, was not as much an opposition to the Bolshevik Party as a whole, but an opposition specifically to Trotsky's leadership of the army during the Civil War. To summarize rather quickly, as I might explore more in depth in the future, Trotsky made use of a strict hierarchy in the army. He also employed former Tsarist officers to make up for the lack of the Bolsheviks' own. Many people were opposed to this, but it was Smirnov in particular who raised the most alarm about the latter policy. He argued that the army needed to be politicized, with commissars adjacent to army officers as a check to ensure their loyalty. During the 8th Party Congress, where Smirnov initially voiced his concerns on the state of the army, he, along with Timofei Sapronov and Nikolai Osensky, formed the Democratic Centralist faction in the Bolshevik Party. The activities and ideas of this group I'll be focusing on more in depth in another video, but for now, we'll focus on the story of Sapronov and Smirnov, who from 1919 onward were linked firmly together as oppositionists. The original faction of the Democratic Centralists operated from 1919 up until 1921, when factions were banned following the Kronstadt Revolt. Although this faction ceased to exist formally, Sapronov and his comrades still held on to their views on party democracy and democratic centralism, and so at various moments they would still rear their heads in protest on this or that policy. Years later, in 1923, following Trotsky's letter to the Central Committee, but also independently of Trotsky's own agenda, Sapronov and 45 other Bolsheviks signed their own document, which they sent to the Politburo on October 15th. The platform of the 46, as it was called, was signed by 46 members of the Bolshevik Party under various circumstances. For Sapronov and Osensky, they, quote, share the views of this appeal, and believe that, quote, the demand for a direct and sincere approach to all our ills has become so urgent that they, quote, entirely support the proposal to call the conference suggested in order to lay down the practical ways of escape from the accumulation of difficulties. Smirnov signed the document, not fully in agreement with its proposals, but he and some others were, quote, profoundly convinced that the condition of the party demands the taking of radical measures, since the condition in the party at the present time is not healthy. And thus, as a result, the first party meeting on the topic of intra-party democracy occurred on December 11th, where Sapronov gave his speech at the Moscow party meeting. He starts his speech saying, Comrades, we have heard today the report of Comrade Kamenev, a representative of the Central Committee, who, instead of discussing the question above us, inter-party democracy, devoted all of his speech to a defense of the party apparatus, maintaining the attacks on the party apparatus were attacks on the old guard and consequently on the Central Committee. Hence, it is clear that it supposedly becomes a matter of overthrowing the Central Committee, a coup d'etat, and a counter-revolution. But in reality, matters stand quite differently. It might be time for Comrade Kamenev, now that the Politburo and the Presidium of the Central Control Commission have adopted a resolution on democracy, to stop scaring the party with ethereal specters. Even if some apparatus men have such dreams at night, the party does not have these visions of a split and some sort of coup d'etat. Sapronov then discusses in his speech the party apparatus and the views of both Trotsky and Kamenev on the nature of this so-called apparatus. He charges Kamenev for not trusting in party initiative and relegating everything to this apparatus, saying, members of the Politburo evidently regard this question in different ways. For Comrade Kamenev's and Comrade Trotsky's estimation of the apparatus are completely contrary, and it is not Kamenev who is correct in his estimation. It is incorrect to pose the question as if the apparatus will save us. Only apparatus men can see the salvation in the apparatus, and not in the initiative of the party. We know the apparatuses of Western Europe, and we know German social democracy. It is well known to all of us, and to Comrade Kamenev too, that German social democracy has been saved up until now only thanks to the fact that the apparatus has kept it from disintegration. It is correct that the apparatus saves social democracy, but is it correct that German social democracy is defending the interests of the working class? From who is the party being saved by the apparatus? Not from the bourgeoisie, not from Stennis, not from Krupp. It is being saved from the revolutionary German working class. Comrade Kamenev proposes that we be saved from the party by the apparatus. We need to do exactly the opposite. The party is sufficiently strong to rebuild its apparatus at the right time and to adjust it at the right time. Not the party for the apparatus, but the apparatus for the party. That's how the question stands. He also attacks Kamenev for making use of Lenin's name as an appeal to authority for his proposals, speaking out that today we find everywhere, whether it is relevant or not, mentions of Comrade Lenin's name, as with Comrade Kamenev. Such and such resolution was written by Comrade Lenin. Such and such resolution was written by him too. If he were still with us, he would have certainly said this or that. To make reference to the fact that we were friends of Lenin, and thus will remain Leninists all our life, and continually hide ourselves behind Lenin's back. To do this is blatant demagogy. They want to seek salvation and hide behind someone else's back. Unfortunately, we now have to discuss the question without Comrade Lenin, so let us not hide behind his back, but advance our own viewpoints. Stalin was quick to attack Sapronov, however, speaking in return. The opposition has made a habit of extolling Lenin as the greatest of all geniuses. I'm afraid that this praise is not altogether sincere. They want, by raising the ballyhoo about Lenin's genius, to camouflage their own abandonment of him and to stress at the same time the weakness of his disciples. But permit us to ask you, Comrade Preobrazhensky, how is it that you found yourself in profound disagreement with this great genius on the question of the Brest-Litovsk peace, and Comrade Sapronov, who now falsely and pharisaical showers praises upon Lenin, is the very same Sapronov who at one time dared to label him an ignoramus and oligarch. And Sapronov likely did call him such and such names, as Trotsky once had years before during the Bolshevik and Menshevik split. But despite Sapronov's attacks on Lenin, which Lenin often returned. He still admired and followed Lenin, but like Bukharin, Shliapnikov, and many of Lenin's other followers, he was not afraid to criticize him. When Lenin was shot by Fanning Kaplan in 1918, Sverdlov designated Sapronov to find him a place of residence where he could be cared for, and during this time, Sapronov was his bodyguard. When Sapronov was openly attacking Lenin in the 1920s, he was holding key party positions and working in central state bodies, despite being an open oppositionist. When Lenin did die in January of 1924, while the struggle between the Troika and the opposition was ongoing, Sapronov was one of the pallbearers at Lenin's funeral. After Lenin died, everything would change for Sapronov and Smirnov. Ossensky left his comrades and rejoined with Bukharin, while these two would revive the Democratic Centralist faction and began to operate clandestinely. Between 1924 and 1927, they recruited members and polemicized with the Trotskyists. In 1926, Sapronov and Smirnov helped lay the foundations of the united opposition with Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. But the Democratic Centralists formed their own left faction within it, as they differed greatly from Trotsky on various matters, and they despised Zinoviev and Kamenev. When the left in 1927 presented its platform of the joint opposition, the leaders of the Democratic Centralists, now operating as the Group of 15, presented their own separate platform, the Platform of the 15, in which they criticized the policies of the Stalin-Bukharin Duumvirate, as well as those of Trotsky and his group. Following the 15th Congress in December, all of the members of the joint opposition were expelled from the party. Smirnov, Sapronov, and other Democratic Centralists were then arrested and sent into exile. Sapronov was sent north to Arkhangelsk, near the Arctic, while Smirnov was deported to the Urals. However, even in exile, they continued their opposition and refused to renounce their views. They held discussions and maintained correspondence with other like-minded people on the fate of the revolution. Smirnov himself wrote in a letter, "I have always considered it shameful to hide my views and convictions. I have openly said that the current leaders of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks have betrayed the proletariat, that the current government, acting under the guise of Soviet power, which it has in fact destroyed, is hostile to the working class, and that the proletariat must and will fight against it for its dictatorship, for the genuine power of the Soviets." While in exile and in prisons, they formed left communist circles, and although they were imprisoned alongside Trotskyists, they refused to associate with them or the Zinovievists. When Smirnov heard of the rumor that Trotsky had capitulated, like so many other former left oppositionists, Smirnov declared boisterously, "Trotsky has capitulated? That is all too good. This semi-Menshevik will now at least cease to hamper the authentic revolutionary movement by his presence." When some imprisoned members of the Dekists began to recant their positions and submit statements declaring that they left the opposition, Smirnov and Sapronov held firm, demonstrating that they genuinely believed in what they were fighting for. In 1931, Sapronov would write a very inflammatory oppositional essay titled Agony of the Petty Bourgeois Dictatorship, where he described the USSR as ceasing to be a worker state, arguing that the Thermidor had been complete and state capitalism took hold in Russia. He believed that the party had ceased to be the party of the working class and now represented the petty bourgeoisie, and that the party had submitted to the kulaks. At the end of his essay, he writes rather sharply, "The second round of imperialist wars and socialist revolutions is coming, and the task of the real communist Bolsheviks is to draw lessons from the past and the present and lead the proletariat on the right path into the coming battle. We must make it clear to the working class that the communists have nothing in common with this policy and the petty bourgeois dictatorship. It is the policy of renegades of communism. In our factories, not socialism, but capitalist forms of exploitation, not social competition, but an ultra-bourgeois sweatshop system. There are no collective farms in the countryside, but there are state-owned enterprises of a compulsory nature. There is not socialization, but expropriation of small proprietors, including the poor peasants. To call our economy socialist means committing a crime against the proletariat and discrediting the ideas of communism, and consequently, indirectly helping the bourgeoisie. Our aim remains unchanged: communism. The means? Social revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hence, the struggle not only with the bourgeoisie, but also with all those who substitute the idea of communism with all kinds of petty bourgeois nonsense. Both Sapronov and Smirnov suffered greatly, but after Kirov's assassination in 1934, things only got worse. The terms of their respective exiles had been repeatedly extended. While serving the term of their latest exiles, both were arrested again and sent to Butrika prison. During their interrogations, they both denied taking part in counter-revolutionary activities. Smirnov in particular refused even to define his political views. Sapronov's wife, who had also been sentenced in 1929, would also be charged along with them. In 1937, on charges of organizing and being involved in a counter-revolutionary terrorist organization, both Sapronov and Smirnov would be executed. It would take until 1989 for Smirnov to be rehabilitated, and 1990 for Sapronov. Both Smirnov and Sapronov were true believers, and Sapronov was the ideal worker Bolshevik, the proletarian turned revolutionary. While Smirnov took to the books, Sapronov was one to go to the factory, to speak with the workers. Both had great faith in the power of the working class, and they both died sticking firmly to what they believed in, never capitulating like many other oppositionists.